Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We are just a week away from the start of the legislative session. I've spent much of the past week digging through a mountain of bills, getting our bill lists and bill trackers set up, which we will post on our website very soon. Also this week, there was a real hootenanny of a debate for the position of Oklahoma City mayor, although the current mayor was not a participant in that debate. The Corporation Commission voted to increase your home natural gas bills by a decent chunk every single month for the next 25 years. And Oklahoma Watch published a very insightful and I think helpful piece of investigative journalism that will help all of us, help the public monitor for conflicts of interest in the state legislature. Joining me to discuss all of this and more is my friend and co-host, Dr. Scott Melson. Hello, sir.
Do you know what the definition of the word hootenanny is?
No, did you just Google it?
Yeah, so a hootenanny is an informal gathering with folk music and sometimes dancing.
Well, that
And if
doesn't
you
quite describe the debate. What's the word for screaming match and racist diatribes?
if you ask Google to use it in a sentence, it says, quote, "I realized that a lot of my songs were sing-along quality, and yeah, I can get out there and have a hootenanny vibe. We're only a trio, so we can't have a hootenanny, but I'd settle for a shindig."
That's quite a definition.
So that's where I'm at. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for being here. Bailey is out today, and so to fill her shoes, we had to bring in not one but two state legislators. They are Senator Julia Kirt and Representative Cyndi Munson. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Hello.
We're excited you're here, and we are going to visit more in depth with Senator Kirt and Representative Munson in just a moment. But first, Scott, let's talk about this new report from Oklahoma Watch. Have you looked at it yet?
Yeah, so I was just looking at it. Before we get on. This is, I believe, the first time that these documents, these financial disclosures that the legislators file, have been made available in a searchable way where you can go on and really easily look and see who has what and where. Yeah, it's very interesting. I was just looking at the first one that came up is Senator Adam Pugh from Edmond. I'm not picking on Senator Pugh. He was just literally the first one that I was looking at. And so it's interesting. It kind of goes through. It's the statement that delineates everything legislators are required to disclose.
As a potential conflict of interest, right?
Yes. And it's just, I think it's funny, maybe not funny, maybe it doesn't matter, because you have to list the entities that you might have ownership. It's an ownership of 5% or more, an ownership that is valued at 50,000 or more, it looks like, income that's more than 20,000. So that's the cutoff, but you don't say what the value is. So it's
right.
It's more than 50,000, but if it's 5 million, who knows?
Right.
So I find that interesting.
Yeah. So this whole thing is real interesting to me, right? So they have to check all of these boxes. Like I understand that, we can't use our office for private gain, blah, 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 blah. And then there's a bunch of boxes where they disclose that. And it's for themselves and for their spouse or dependent, right? And you identify who that is. So you give the name and address of the entity, a description, which is optional, and then who it is in your family that has that relationship. And sometimes in reading through this, and I stayed up way late last night reading these because I went down a rabbit hole of reading these. They were interesting, and it varies quite a bit, I think, on how much is disclosed by each person, right? Some people fill in all kinds of information in the description box, which is helpful because as a member of the voting public, it helps me understand exactly what that potential or real conflict of interest is. And others, it's just like the name of a business, and the business is like Ajax LLC. And you're like, I don't know what the hell that is. Like, what do you do foundation repair? Do you do oil and gas? Like, what does it mean?
Did you look at McCall's?
He has quite a few.
It's a whole page.
Yeah,
There's a
him.
whole extra table.
It was interesting. So Speaker McCall and Leader Eccles had pretty extensive lists, and then Senator Treat had like nothing. I mean, his wife worked for Langford, which we knew, right? But that was it. And I was like, huh. And so after reading it, I have a few takeaways, a few things I learned, and reading through all 149 of these, right, is that a lot of legislators own rental property. Sometimes it's residential, sometimes it's commercial, but like I didn't tally it up, and I wish I had. It was a considerable number. I don't know, a fourth of them maybe. Um, Several of them, I would say 10 or more, have some kind of are involved somehow in like financial investment firms, right? So maybe it's stocks or some kind of financial management, and that makes sense. That usually means they're self-employed and set their own schedule, which makes it easier to be the capital for 4 months of the year and schedule around things otherwise. Naturally, there's a lot of livestock related businesses, cow and hay businesses. That makes sense. Um, Several listed their public pensions or retirement funds, which I appreciated, right? I get it. Some folks are retired and they ran for office and they are drawing a retirement from some kind of like public employees retirement. And if they're going to be voting on, cost of living increases for those things, that is certainly a potential conflict of interest. I only saw one that I remember that disclosed ownership of oil and gas leases. It was Representative Zach Taylor. He has quite a few. He had several pages of like 5% stake, 1/3 stake, and all these oil and gas leases. And I won't say he was for sure the only one, but he might have been. And it was still odd that it was that few, right? So then I wondered, well, then other people not, or maybe they have just smaller stakes. Hard to say. Um, I saw one that referenced, quote, various stocks. And given the conversation at the national level of whether or not, people in Congress should own individual stocks, I thought that was interesting that I only noticed one of those, especially given the number of people whose job is like some kind of investment firm. Um, Representative Crosswhite Hayter's husband is a county commissioner in Canadian County. I didn't realize that. And then both Senator McCourtney and Senator Garvin own a minority stake in the same hospice company. I happened to read one then the other, and I was like, oh, that's the same hospice company. So that's interesting.
Did you, Andy, find anyone who offered a description other than like just the name, address, and relationship?
Yeah, there's a bunch.
I only saw one. Josh West offered a description, but he's the only one I've gone through that description of his disclosures.
Yeah, so that's not the most.
It's not required.
It's not required. I would say a lot left it blank. I don't know. It's probably half and half. I don't know. There was quite a few, and some of them were like, "This is a storage facility that I co-own with my wife and this one other person," and some of them kind of broke it down. And so you were like, I always felt like I appreciated when they disclosed more, which is often the way transparency works. So, Senator Kirt disclosed that her husband is a dentist, which I think many people know. He owns a dental practice. That was good. Representative Munson had no disclosures on there. So, um, she exclaims to the camera, "I don't have any. That's nothing to disclose," which is legitimate, right? That can be the case. And I think given the conversation at the national level about stock, it's probably been on my mind. And then Oklahoma Watch ran this story. But Scott, does strike me, maybe a related question, right? That many legislators run bills or serve on committees that address the industry in which they work in their day job. For example, I mean, there's a legislator who is an insurance agent, and that person might also serve on the insurance committee, right? Or a physician, someone like you, right, who could be a legislator and then serves on like the Health and Human Services or something to deal with the healthcare authority budget, right?
Or someone might run a bill saying that spouses of legislators can own a tag agency, and then their spouse might inherit a tag agency.
Right. So that's the other thing, is that we have a very recent tangible example of a legislator who had a conflict of interest that is on his disclosure form, right? Um, but I haven't gone back to look at last year to see. But I think this recognition, right? Lots of things, right? People are going to be voting on bills, and even if not voting, because they can, and this came up with Representative O'Donnell, right? They can um, take their constitutional privilege and abstain from voting on a bill if it's a presents a conflict of interest. But that doesn't mean they weren't involved in moving the bill through the process, right? And so, do you think, and this is a certain opinion, but Scott, do you think that it is can be good, that it is, I'd say, on the whole, better, more good and helpful for someone who works in an industry and has experience there to be in charge of moving legislation related to that industry? Or do you think that runs the risk, and there's greater risk of them influencing rules and regulations and whatever that could be in unethical ways?
I mean, this is a really tough question, and this is something we talk about a lot, and I think it's really hard because there's industries, many industries that are very complicated, and certainly it helps to have people with relevant expertise and experience involved in the process of making regulations and oversight, governance, etc. So I think you can cut both sides. But I think if you're going to do that, you have to have safeguards in place to make sure that like they're not in charge of like setting up rules that are going to directly benefit them, right? Like I should not be able to be a doctor who owns a practice that loosens a regulation for medical practices that starts making me money like in June as soon as session is out. There needs to either be like a cooling off period, or there needs to be like there has to be some sort of safeguard to make sure that's the interest of the public, not just the interest of the 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 legislator.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a gray area in a lot of cases. I mean, occasionally there's real black and white ones, but I think there's a lot of bills that pertain overall to an industry, and I think there is some value in the expertise that legislators from a wide variety of professions bring. I pushed hard the last couple of years for ethics training. As legislators, we actually have zero requirement for ethics training or continuing ed, which is shocking to me as a new one. I was shocked because I thought, well, we legislate all these other professions and they're required continuing ed, but we're not required to at all. So I ran a bill specifically requiring us to take ethics training, and it actually got heard in a committee last year and failed dramatically. And there's a lot of fear of even discussing ethics. Ethics is generally, I would say, discussed in terms of compliance, not in terms of understanding power and influence. And I feel like we need a lot more training, a lot more conversation about it, because those lines are gray. Last year, I'm pretty sure that Senator Chuck Hall is the only one I saw take constitutional privilege on the floor of the Senate, and it was for a banking bill. And he was surprised no one else did. But he took it pretty seriously. One challenge is once you take a constitutional privilege, you pretty much have set yourself up to do that forever. So they kind of make us scared to take constitutional privilege. So I feel like that should be clearer. I talked to one legislator last year on something he's an expert in. I called him specifically for his advice, and he said, I've not been involved with that at all because it's too direct a conflict with my work. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because he felt like he shouldn't even be involved with the discussion or negotiation surrounding it, whereas others feel like it's only the vote. Like we had some folks take constitutional privilege in a committee about military tax benefits being exempt. We had several military members and veterans speak on the bill and then take privilege. So they've already been influential in the decision about the bill getting heard. They've even made a plea in the committee meeting, and then they take privilege. And I think it's just gray, and we don't have very clear leadership from our leadership or precedent to help us there. And people are afraid to call the ethics commission because they're afraid they're just going to get that it's going to cause more scrutiny.
Right. Yeah, I was really curious what y'all's experience is as legislators filling this out, thinking about this on a personal level. Representative Munson, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think to your point about what different members have investments and their flexibility in terms of their work and income, quite frankly. It's really hard to recruit or convince or encourage people who are working jobs that are either not salary based or they're not flexible, so they can actually run a decent campaign. Um, and if I had it my way, it would be that legislators make a living wage and we all have to separate ourselves from our current employment or investment or however we get wherever our finances come from. When you're trying to get someone to run for office or you're thinking about running for office and you only make $47,000, which I know sounds like a lot, trust me, in terms of, but these are we're a part-time legislature in the sense of we're only in for, a few months of the year, but we are working nonstop. Senator Kirt and I, this interim, I think we've been at the Capitol 2 or 3 times a week because we're on additional committees. And in full transparency, we get like an additional like $25 or something for those meetings, but it also takes a ton of time to prepare, and get ready for your work. And trust me, we go through lots of documents to prepare for questions and really get our minds wrapped around the issue that we're dealing with. And so I wish there were some more conversation around that and how it relates to legislator salary. And I know people don't feel bad for politicians, whether or not they make enough money, but it certainly um, shapes, in terms of the legislature, who's going to be running for office and what type of legislators you're going to get. You don't want solely independent wealthy folks there. And also, just really quickly, the constitutional privilege point, and to your point, Andy, about the amount of members who own property. When there was the legislation that Representative Tom Gann was running about basically making it a little bit easier to evict somebody from your property, when you looked up at the board, it was the most colorful board I have ever seen in my time serving, because constitutional privilege is blue, absent is yellow, and then of course if you're for it, it's green, if you're against, it's red. And I remember looking at the board and thinking, I had no idea how many of my colleagues own property. Good on them for taking constitutional privilege. But anyway, but that also, this is for another day, but when you look at our tenant laws and landlord tenant laws and how all that shakes out, sides more with the landlord, but we can talk about that later. But it's reflective of who's in the legislature and what financial ties they have.
Yeah, it's worth reading about, and I will link in the show notes to this episode to that Oklahoma Watch story. Basically, what I think Trevor Brown at Oklahoma Watch did was go to the Ethics Commission, download all the forms, put them into a Google Drive, and then make a easy to navigate like little page where you can link to them, so that they're all in one place and easier to find, rather than all of us having to do what he did, and that is go in and look up each legislator individually and sort through all the pages and find the one. So really appreciate Trevor's time on that. I sent him a message and said, this is tremendous and very interesting, seeing it, right? And I think, I think that the public is increasingly aware that corruption is a thing, right? Like, anecdotally, everyone's, to Representative Munson, to your point, right? People will say, politicians are all corrupt. It's like, well, they're not all corrupt, but there is corruption, right? That this does happen, and it happens in big, bold ways and also little erosive ways. And I think these kinds of tools, right? This is what it's designed for, is to reduce that corruption.
Well, and I mean, you can use the word cronyism too, because I think corruption implies a level of fraud that would be that a district attorney is going to take on. I think we have to also talk about cronyism where we're doing favoritism that benefits us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, no one likes it when they see that, oh, well, this contractor got the bid because they're the brother-in-law of this politician, right? That kind of stuff just rubs people the wrong way.
Not illegal, just shady.
Right. Yeah. That's Scott's. I think listeners may know this, but each week on the podcast, Scott changes his display name on the interface here on StreamYard, and That may be one for a future episode, or you may be changing it right now. Let's see. Today, Scott's name is McGirt is the supreme law of the land, which is probably a good occasion, Scott, to mention that the governor was dealt another blow in his quest to overturn McGirt this week.
I'm shocked to find out that there is gambling going on in here. I can't believe it. I can't believe that yet again the Supreme Court has declined to hear a direct request to overturn a decision that they handed down. Has it been 2 years ago now? Right? Like that was like argument was like March of 2020 because it was virtual arguments, but it was still fairly early in the pandemic. Yeah. So yes, I have nothing else to say. I just think it's, I think it was interesting that Representative Tom Cole, Congressman Cole, did put out. There was an article. What I think it was in the Oklahoman, but he's quoted as essentially saying, like, "Hey, so it appears like the governor wants this to be overturned. It doesn't look like that's going to happen." And he directly says, like, is there a time when we should start behaving like trying to be cooperative rather than antagonistic to the tribes? Essentially saying, come on, like, enough with this nonsense. Like, let's move forward and figure out how we're going to work together um, in this post McGirt world. Senator, or I keep saying Senator, Congressman Cole, I believe, is a member of the Chickasaw Nation. I believe that's right. And it has done a lot of work in kind of tribal legislation in his tenure in Congress, and I think is regarded as somebody who has a lot of experience and expertise with this, and has not been real sympathetic to the governor's position throughout this whole deal. So I thought it was interesting to see someone who is a very senior member of the Republican establishment in Washington and here at home say, like, enough already. Like, it's not going to happen. Like, stop it.
Yeah, that was his statement was interesting. He was just like, "Listen, we're stronger if we work together. Quit warring with the tribes, and we can win this." And that's not happening.
I hate the term elder statesman, but it was very elder statesman-y.
Yeah, well, he knows. Congressman Cole is a very smart man. He knows what's up. A smart man and a shrewd politician. So, all right. Also very tall, taller than you think. Whenever I've met him in person,
true story.
You are an imposing
True
fellow.
story.
All right. Well, let's talk about the disability waiting list again. All right, listeners probably remember several episodes ago we had some folks on to discuss the perpetually long disability waiting list, and it's been a focus of some of the budget request hearings that have happened at the Capitol over the last couple of weeks. And both Senator Kirt and Representative Munson have filed bills to deal with this, to address this, and that's why they're on the show today, to help talk about it. We have reached out to Justin Brown and invited him or someone from his staff on to talk about it from the agency side, right, of what they're doing internally. And I think my hope is, right, that we are moving towards a solution that involves obviously the state government. It involves the state legislature and how we govern around these programs, and it involves the community, the people that are on the waiting list that receive these services as well. So, Representative Munson, do you want to tell us a little bit about your bill and how where it comes from and what you're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I am the House author on both of Senator Kurt's Senate bills. So I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about that. But I also have a House bill, which would essentially require DHS to send out an initial letter telling a family or an individual that they are on the DDS waiting list. They would have to send that by certified mail. And then yearly or annually, they would get a letter from DHS just letting them know, still on the list, this is your placement, any other pertinent information that's necessary for that individual or family. Also sent by certified mail. This idea came from the, my first conversation ever learning about the DDS waiting list was in my first election when I was a baby candidate and I was out knocking doors. There was a constituent, now a constituent of mine, who told me about the waiting list, gave me, their family story, and told me that when he had called, once they met the, like, I think were they at 10 or 11 years, they had called DHS to say, "We've waited. Is it our turn yet?" Essentially. And the response he got from DHS was, "Oh, you were removed from the list. Your daughter was removed from the list." And he's like, "Well, did you notify me? I never received anything from DHS. Do you have record of that?" And the answer was no. And so this story has kind of come up numerous times as I've talked to families, and have learned that that's of a lot of the issues that we're trying to address. This is pretty frustrating in terms of communication, because it always sort of lands on the family or that individual that they didn't do their part, but there's no way to track that they were even communicated to, or communicated with. So this is an attempt to improve communication and sort of hold both accountable. And hopefully it'll be helpful. We'll see how it gets through the process. It was assigned to full A and B. And as you all know, that's a pretty big committee, and there's a lot of work, because there is a fiscal impact. We're estimating maybe between $15,000 and $20,000 to the agency. So I'll have more information on that later. But I hope that DHS will embrace the idea, and if there are changes that we need to make, definitely open to hearing what those might be. But this is an attempt to improve communication between the agency and those who need services. I think that's really important. And since it continues to come up, I think it's a solution worth trying.
So I'll say first, thank you for saying fiscal impact instead of physical impact. I really appreciate that. That just helps. So I haven't read your bill yet. I will. It is on my list. What exactly does it do?
In terms of the letters?
Yes. Like it
It's-
just like
It requires the agency to send information to those on the waiting list or who are waiting for services. The letter or information, the mail has to be sent by certified mail.
okay. Okay.
Just
So
keeps
that's
them
where
in the
the
loop, right?
that's
So they're
where the
not
fiscal
floating around wondering where they're at.
and that's where the fiscal impact
Right.
comes
Correct.
from, right?
Yes.
Okay. That seems completely reasonable.
And surely they can find
I agree.
$15,000 in a $10 billion budget. There's a full 6 zeros past what it would cost for this. So that's my thought.
And quite frankly, like I said, it helps both. So they have a track record, and then it's the responsibility of that family or individual to make sure. I mean, when we get certified mail, we get a nice envelope with green certified mail, or we have to go to the post office and pick the letter up. And so I think it's helpful and something that should be an easy solution.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I think information helps, right? The more information is always helpful, particularly to folks who are out there wondering, waiting to find out what's up. Even just a status update, right? If you're in line at the, tag agency or wherever waiting to be served, you kind of want to know where you are in line. Has the line moved? Am I still in line? Do you know who I am? Right? Please don't forget about me. Yeah. Senator Kirt, you want to tell us about your bills?
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate Representative Munson's take, because I think it's very simple, and it just is so, I mean, I don't feel like it needs to be done in legislation, but I think when you look at the commitment and the trust level right now for families who've waited so long, having something in statute actually, helps them and helps the agency, because, we know that leadership changes between gubernatorial administrations, if not more frequently. And the systems that are needed, we need to get them in place. And so that my bills are actually in the same vein, in talking with Representative Munson and kind of the interactions we've had with families who are confused and waiting, information from the agency about the assessments they're doing about folks who are waiting on the waiting list, confusion about the past, what happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. There's a lot of baggage there. And I think that we have to find ways to bridge and build trust. And we definitely want the agency to be able to serve all these folks, but they need information in the meantime. So I think, the big thing with my bills that Cindy's helping me with is one would require ongoing information about who's being served now. That's the kind of information you could request through an open records request. Probably would be really messy. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges with transparency is making it meaningful any way that someone from the outside could understand the information or know on an ongoing basis. There's been family groups that have done this on a regular basis. There's been an advocate who's done it for years. She was on your podcast, Wanda Felty, has gotten information from DHS and put it in a readable format so it could be compared month to month and year to year. And without the ability to compare, you don't really know what's happening if people are aging in the system. What's happening with the folks that are waiting, we have no idea. So that's the other piece, is that we ran a bill specifically. The agency is contracted with an outside entity, a private entity, to assess everyone on the waiting list and to create intake. So part of that contract was actually they're taking over the intake process for DHS. And so we're supposed to have lots of information at our fingertips in a brand new fancy online source that can create dashboards. And we want that to be public. We just want to guarantee to folks that will be public in an aggregated manner. So not individual, client information, but an aggregated understanding of what are people needing? What services are being used? What age? If someone passes away on the waiver or goes into an institution, where's that money going? And those are all questions that have been very hard to answer in a consistent way. And it's not anything about this specific administration. This is regardless of administration over decades and decades and decades. This has been a challenge. So we feel like creating something very specific. The bill outlines the specific data that needs to be released. Of course, the agency could release more on a consistent basis. But I feel like it creates a yardstick also for the advocates who might feel like they're being dismissed to know, no, this is going to come out. And then on the flip side, the agency can say, hey, we're giving you what you need in order to understand what we're doing. And so I feel like it creates a bridge that's needed right now. And especially as the agency really is looking to eliminate the wait list is what they talk about. And of course, we want to make sure that means that everyone on the list is getting served who is eligible. And then I think the other thing is, if we could get through that, that's been the big dumpster fire we haven't actually dealt with, that our waivers don't serve the needs now. They do not include autism solely as an eligibility criteria. And we now have a huge influx of individuals who need services for autism. They have to have intellectual disability to qualify now. We actually don't have a waiver for individuals who suffer a traumatic brain injury or the like. We don't have waivers set up for that. So because of this waiting list kind of causing this ongoing challenge, we haven't really dealt with who people are and what they need now. So I feel like more information on a consistent basis in meaningful ways that legislators and the public can see would be a big step forward.
Yeah, for sure. Managing this is a lot of work for a lot of people. And state employees are honestly, I think, in my opinion, doing the best they can, right? They're doing what they can do with the limited resources that they're given. And now they're supposed to go substitute teach as well, right? So it's a lot of work for them, and really hats off to our public servants for doing that. Years ago, I was the director of a medical program for a clinic. I guess it was a wraparound services clinic for people with HIV. I think a lot of our listeners know that. And when I started there, we had also habitually or perpetually been underfunded, right? We're federally funded, and funding for HIV is not what it used to be. And so we had a waiting list for people to get in for new patient appointments. Now, this is not just unique to HIV and AIDS. A lot of specialties have long waiting lists. And when I first got there, they would say, "Oh, we've got a waiting list for new patient appointments." And I said, "Well, let me see the list." And you could kind of see the staff like, it's not actually a list. I was like, "Well, how do you know?" And there was like a way in the scheduling system they could find out who was supposed to be next. And basically they just, they could find those people and bump them in. And I was like, I think we need a list, because it would help me as an administrator. It would help all of our staff to kind of, and the doctors, right, to know exactly how long is this list. And if someone cancels today and we have an opening today, who can we call? Let's start calling the first 10 people, right? And whoever can get here first gets in, and we can try to reduce this list some. And then annually we started going through it, checking in to see if any of those folks had moved or got services elsewhere or whatever. And it was just it wasn't even that long of a list, right? It was like just at times 20 or 50 people that had to wait, however many months. And we were able to address it. Funding increased. We, made some changes to how we scheduled things. But it was one of those like tangible memories of like, I think we need like this list in a file cabinet somewhere that we can actually reference and do something to keep these people in the loop. Because if that's you, like we want to know if their health is getting worse, what's going on, so that we can make sure that they get triaged appropriately.
We've seen, I mean, that's been the thing is like a lot of the people who get on the waiting list, they're told to do it because everyone says it's going to take forever. So they might have a 3-year-old and they get on the waiting list and they may not be communicated with for years and years. And they have significant things that they're managing as a family. I've seen their care maps before. They're dealing with school issues, IEP issues. If their loved one has medical frailties, they're dealing with all kinds of different physicians, psychiatrists, etc. And it's a burden. When I look at the type of paperwork, the qualifications folks have to meet to get disability designation, families are dealing with a lot. So we do need to make communication easier on them. I think expecting them to know what's going on and, oh, which message am I getting from, this agency or that agency? And have I replied? I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt as much as we can. And that's tough. It takes a lot of time, but we've been there and we haven't been helping folks. And that's been a priority of this process that they're going through with the assessment. They're supposed to be giving people some of the services they can access now, but it's just making sure it's something people can use, because a parent having to call another 10 phone numbers, it's too much when folks are in challenging environments and just trying to get their kid where they need to be.
Yeah.
Have you guys, either of you, have you gotten any, if you can say, have you gotten any pushback from the agency on this? Like, how has this been received by the folks who will be on the implementation end?
Well, for the bills, when I talked to them about it, it really was about, we'll see if it's something we're able to do. They're really worried about whether their technology advancements have come far enough to make that straightforward. They don't want to have somebody dedicated to, putting information out all day long on one program, which I understand. So they we're very much in communication about it. I don't know. What do you think, Representative Munson?
Yeah, I think naturally there's some wariness and, questions and um partly because, yeah, to your point, they have to implement it. It has to work within their systems. And so, when Senator Kirt and I filed these bills and had these ideas, we're doing it we want to be collaborative. We're not doing it to attack the agency. It's really to find a way to get to a solution. With the information that we've been given and all the work we've done around this, we don't want to just keep talking about it. We don't want to just keep repeating the number of Oklahomans who are waiting for services. That's not helping anybody. And quite frankly, you have many of these families who are calling us and asking us, what's the progress? What's being done? You keep talking about it. You say you care about my family and I. So what are you actually doing to address the issue? And so I can understand, agencies, like we said, our state employees are doing so much. At the end of the day, it's not the top level administrators or executives who are going to have to work through this. It's those frontline, front facing, they're the ones who provide the services. They're going to have to put this in their workflow. And so I'm certainly cognizant of that. I don't want to speak for Senator Kirt, but I'm assuming she is as well. And so we're happy to find ways to make it work, but it is incumbent upon us to hold the agency accountable for more transparency and some better practices when it comes to communication and working through this issue that's been a problem for, well, over a decade now.
Yeah. Can I add that, one of the reasons we went this route was after the Legislative Office of a Fiscal Transparency report last summer. So LOFT put out a report, and the Department of Human Services very much disputed the findings of that report. And so one of our things is, well, okay, well then you put the numbers out. We'd be glad to see your numbers on an ongoing basis. And And so I think if the Department of Human Services doesn't think what Loft found was accurate, we need them to consistently help us know what they see. Loft showed discrepancies between what the healthcare authority had on record and what the feds had on record. And I think those are things that lead to distrust. And I'm not trying to blame the agency. I'm just saying, how can we make this better together and make sure that we're helping people get the services they need and spend the money well,
This is a rhetorical question. I mean, unless we want to get into it, because you could have a whole episode or a whole series of episodes about this. But issues like the waiting list, issues like what we do here in terms of our carceral system, healthcare. This is one of those issues that makes me think, like, what do they do other places, right? Like, and I don't even mean just like other states who might have a different system that serves people better, but like what does it look like to go to another place and kind of like completely reimagine how you provide these services? And like and I don't want to say if we had leaders that are willing to do that, because I think we do have some, like you guys, they're just in the minority. Like, what would it look like to completely reimagine how we do this with like a model from, I don't know, like Sweden or something, right? Or like is there a massive investment that you could make in terms of both technological and human infrastructure that would allow these services to be delivered really well and in a timely manner? And I think that there is. I think that probably exists, and it doesn't necessarily have to fall under the ever terrifying creep of Marxism. But like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, it just makes me wonder, like we're kind of, you all as legislators are doing everything you can do to try and help the system that we have function better. But sometimes the part of me that's not an elected person, which is all of me, is like, what would it look like to like just completely transform how we do this?
Well, I think we just have to be mindful that these are gargantuan scale. And I can't even imagine in states that have significantly bigger population, but the scale is pretty enormous. And I'll just say, this ties to me to some of the other issues we're having challenges in because of the pandemic. People are become aware that, oh, wait a second, our economy relies on caregiving, caregiving of loved ones, caregiving of children, caregiving of elders. Our families that have loved ones with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they were stuck at home. And some of them still are, because they didn't have options. If their loved one's medically fragile, people shut down. Caregivers were not available. Aides weren't available. And so, you look at how that ties to our overall view, where we just, in modern economics, caregiving economy is not part of the conversation, and it has to be realistically moving forward.
Yeah, I think both those points are correct. I do wish there was some kind of like giant scoreboard where we could just line up, the other 49 models for how states do things. Some of them are great, some of them are terrible, and then we could just kind of compare them all to one another and be like, hey, look, here's some best practices. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into it. Not everything is even possible under a given state's laws, but surely there's a model out there that's better.
Yeah, that's what Loft did, frankly. And, I don't always agree with the policy recommendations that come from the Loft, but they compare state to state. It's very hard to know the history of some of the things. And I'll say that I don't know if the Loft can always say it like it is. They made it very clear in that report that in other states, either the development disability services are independent or they're a part of the healthcare authority type entity, the Medicaid agency. They were not going to recommend, oh, you need to move this. But I think they made it real clear that in other states it's done differently. Those are politically fraught decisions. And it's hard to assess whether it's the right move. It is affected by the amount of change that would be necessary, I guess I'll say.
Yeah, there's no doubt. It's just one of those that, from the outside looking in, sometimes you want to be like, I had a professor in med school, fantastic professor actually, a clinical teacher, and her saying was always, so if I was the benevolent dictator of the world, this is what I would do. I think about that a lot. Like, if I could snap my fingers and try to do something differently, how would I work? But I think the very tough work of politics that you both do is, I think, mostly very tied to incremental change and making the system better one step at a time. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah. Is there, before we go here in just a minute, obviously you all are working on other bills, not just the disability waiting list. Is there anything else you want to highlight for our listeners of passion projects you have going on this year, bills you're really excited about?
Sure. My priority legislation, of course, outside of the bill we just talked about, is an occupational licensing bill that I've worked closely at the time. He was Representative Taylor, so interesting that you brought him up, but now he's a senator. But he and I, opposite parties, live in different worlds, but we are pretty much on the same page when it comes to criminal justice reform, when it comes to in regards to occupational licensing. We worked together on a large piece of legislation a couple of years ago addressing most of the licenses in Oklahoma, but there are quite a few that are not under the occupational licensure licensing statute or title, excuse me. And so gonna hopefully address that this session. I actually thought that it had passed and was signed into law, and I told a group of people that because I'm on the Occupational Licensing Advisory Commission, but I forgot that it got stuck in the Senate when COVID started. So, anyway, but so that's what I'm one of my priority bills to address workforce issues, of course, but the continual effort to improve the lives of those who've been formerly incarcerated. And then another bill that I hope gets some good attention. It's a wrongful conviction bill. So currently in Oklahoma, if you're wrongfully convicted, first of all of that wrongful conviction is listed under our Tort Liability Claims Act. So you can only get a maximum of up to $175,000 if you're wrongfully convicted, and that's it. Texas and Kansas do it way better than we do. So I'm trying to get our, I don't know if I don't want to call them benefits, but
I did not know that.
yeah.
That is part of that law. That is horrendous.
Yes, I know, and I am embarrassed to say I did not know either. I have a close friend, sorority sister, whose father was wrongfully convicted and brought this to my attention. So I started doing some more digging. In Texas and Kansas, they provide. I set the amount at $50,000 for every year you're incarcerated and then going forward. But they also provide healthcare, education, tuition, scholarships for the individual who's incarcerated or a dependent. So I have some of that language in the bill as well, because once you've been incarcerated, whether wrongful or not, it's real hard to get a job, housing, but especially for somebody who was wrongfully convicted by the state, we owe them something. And so I'm trying to correct that. And hopefully just with the public talking a little bit more about the death penalty, death row, incarceration, and what we do in Oklahoma, I hope this is part of the conversation that people will get on board with as well.
Well, I'll just say I've got a couple of different bills related to transparency and ethics and elections that I'm going to continue to push for, whether or not they get heard. I think it's important that we continue to push systems for integrity and systems for transparency. But I think the big thing for me this year is the budget, and I'm very concerned about the folks beginning the year talking about flat budgets when our state was already underfunding so many important health and human services and other functions of government. And we have such a huge opportunity with American Rescue Plan money coming in. I know we don't want to start spending like crazy and have to cut next year, but I think we have to be realistic about how spending on things like one of my major priorities, which is mental health and substance use disorder, impacts families and impacts well-being on an ongoing basis. And so I talked about it this week in the Oklahoma Policy Institute's budget summit, but basically looking at the opportunity costs of not taking action and what that costs. We've tried to calculate that with the waiting list and developmental disability services, because what we found is that many people, when their loved one reaches 18 and doesn't have services yet, they stop working. They become a one earning household. And how, these things impact the economy. So it's not just about human suffering, it's also about well-being. So I really want us to push on the budget and trying to make our budget bolder, and make sure that we're not just hoarding money away, or, definitely not turning away more money in terms of tax cuts and increasing tax credits when we're already a structurally unsound budget. So I don't want folks to be scared of the money. I think we should demand that we serve folks better.
Senator, I want to go on record saying that I agree with everything you just said, but also that I'm already on record saying that there'll be a tax cut this year. I hope I'm wrong. But I want to ask about the budget, and I assume the answer to this is no. But for those of us that spend an inordinate amount of time trying to follow what's happening at 23rd and Lincoln during the session, and I would imagine for you all as legislators as well, particularly who are in the minority, it is like such an unending and like boundless like pot of frustration that the budget is inevitably unveiled 3 days before like sine die, and no one reads it except like the A and B chair. Is there ever any hope of a more transparent budget process, even if it leads to a budget that, in my opinion, is objectively bad for underfunding services and cutting taxes? Is there ever any hope that we'll get a process that we can that at least has more input, more time, and maybe reaches its pinnacle before, like the last day of session?
Well, so I'll just say, it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And I think those running the current process don't quite understand the kind of process we're describing. And I don't blame them for that. I think they've inherited a system that has been dysfunctional for a long time. I think we just have to keep explaining what that means. And I think that the public has to demand that. I mean, with the current system, most senators and reps don't have to answer for their vote on the budget. Everything's put into one big bill. If you vote a certain way, you can blame it on some portion of that. It's too complex for anyone to really critique. And I think we're all off the hook. And frankly, even as someone who cares a lot about the budget and has made an effort to understand it, sometimes I even get disheartened. Is it worth even knowing all this if my input's not considered? So I think that, sometimes I hear people say, well, the public doesn't participate in the budget hearings or whatever. Well, we have to help people understand what's going on, and they have to feel like they have an opportunity for meaningful input. So I think it's possible, but not tomorrow. And I think it's going to take a lot of expectation raising on the part of voters to their elected officials on what they expect.
I can give you a little tiny itty bitty glimmer of hope. I think leaders Virgin and Floyd may have filed some legislation. I know they did a press conference at some point last session about this, about the process being a little more transparent. I think they have. I haven't read all the bills yet. I will do some of that research this weekend, but I think they both have put out efforts to make the process more transparent. And OK Policy did a great job last year highlighting and showing sort of what other states do, because I think it's also really easy to get stuck in this idea that this is what we've always done. Let's keep doing it this way. When you're in the majority, you can do it this way, versus what are some changes we can make that really helps all of us. And I will give credit to Chairman Wallace, who has made efforts to communicate with the Democratic caucus. Obviously, we don't always land in the same place, and we have a lot of questions, and certainly wish those conversations would happen a little bit earlier and a little more proactively versus just, here's what it is, what are your questions and thoughts? But that's the most communication in the last couple of years since he's been chairman that we've had with the budget chair since I've been elected. And we certainly appreciate that. But of course, there are still steps we can take to make it more transparent, and not just about this minority majority fighting at the Capitol that most people don't really pay attention to, but to Senator Kurt's point that the public is more aware of what's going on. This is the most important thing we work on. It is the only thing we have to technically work on. We don't have to do all this other policy stuff. We do have to pass a balanced budget every year. So getting the public more engaged. I've only had one constituent who has asked me detailed questions about the budget and why I voted against it. And it was pretty impressive, the things that she knew, but that's one out of like 37,000 people. So
Well, this year it'll be 2. I will ask you detailed questions about the budget this year instead of just blowharding about it here on the podcast.
fine. No.
There you go.
Call Senator Hicks. She'll be your senator. No, I'm kidding. You can
That
call
works.
me. It's fine.
Well, today I have been thinking about, I guess a phrase has been in my head for no particular reason, but that government isn't something that happens to us, or it shouldn't be, right? Politics isn't just something that happens to us. We, the people, the voters of this great state, have a voice, and far too many of us don't believe that it means anything, right? And so I think we don't use it to the full extent that we can. And so the fact, Representative, that you remember this one person who asked you detailed questions, right, tells you that, like, literally just doing a little bit more than what you're doing right now um, can make a big difference, can stick in the minds of your elected officials, even if that's someone that you agree with, even if it's someone that you vehemently disagree with. You can still have a respectful, important, well researched, well thought out, and like human conversation with them. I'm also struck by the humanity of the bills that the two of you are running, and the way that you spoke about them. Certainly, there is a economic aspect to all of this stuff as well, but I appreciate that you don't lose the humanity of this for a political win or for the sake of job creation or something, right? Like this, most of what government does, most of what government is really good at, is making really positive changes in the lives of people who live here. And as Scott and I like to say from our favorite television show, The West Wing, right? Government should be a force for good, and it really could. So, all right,
I just want to make sure you know, Andy, that government's never created a job.
I tell that to all the state employees who work there.
No, like, it's a fact. We hear it every year. Government's never created a job. Not one. Not ever. Only private job creators do that. Only tax cuts and job creators create jobs. So
The OK Policy had a really good slide this week, and I will also link to some of their stuff, because there was their annual budget summit yesterday, I guess, on Thursday, and it was excellent as always. The opening session from Emma Morris was excellent. All of her slides were excellent. Most of them were very simple to understand. There's a few graphs that are just, it's complicated content, and that's the way it goes. But there was one that showed the impact for us versus other states, and of tax cuts, of cutting services, and all of this. And they broke out like economic growth on its own, and economic growth if you break out oil and gas, right? So like on the whole, Oklahoma's economy has grown, but if you take out oil and gas, we haven't, compared to our geographic neighbors. It was just like one sector, which we all know has an outsized influence on everything in our state. And we have for decades lived and died by the boom and bust cycle of that sector. And we need to recognize that there is an enormous amount of the state economy that is not directly tied to oil and gas, right? And this week, news about the Cherokee Nation and the film industry, right? Like all kinds of stuff that's happening. So, okay, well, we'll get into more important budget discussions with Emma Morris. Actually, I think next Friday she's going to be on the podcast to talk about some of those excellent slides that she made and give us an overview of what the budget situation is right now. And then, as a reminder, on the 7th, that is a Monday, that is the first day of the legislative session, it will open with a joint session of the House and Senate and Governor Stitt delivering his annual State of the State address. We should make a bingo card, Scott.
I'm gonna have to ask my doctor for some migraine medicine.
I haven't decided if I'm going to attend. I may not be able to attend this year, but I'll be watching online and take notes. That's right. Undoubtedly, the middle of the bingo card will say Oklahoma is open for business. That's the nexus of all
the
possibilities.
question is whether we can get through the first line without Oklahoma being open for business, or whether it will come at the very end of like the first intro, like the first paragraph. I think that's going to be it. Like it's going to be like 3 sentences, and the first paragraph will be like, and it's clear at the end of my first administration that Oklahoma is open for business.
There it is. Well,
anyway, thank you all
we've
both
beat
so
the
much
corona.
for right. Thank you all so much for being here. And to Andy's point, in all seriousness, thank you so much for the hard work that you do. Politicians have, as you alluded to, Representative Munson, politicians I think have a bad rap in the pop culture, but public service is really hard. It's really hard. It's really time consuming. The financial rewards are not there, particularly at the state level. And I think especially in a state like Oklahoma, when you're a member of the minority, it can be really frustrating, but you all do incredible work for your constituents, and Oklahoma is better for it. So thank you both very much for your time and expertise.
Thanks for having us. That encouragement goes a long way, by the way. It's going to be till like the next week, so make sure you call or text.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Listeners, thank you for being here as well. Your involvement makes a ton of difference as well. As we say every week, decisions are made by those who show up. And I'll add this week, right, that government isn't something that happens to you. It is about you. It is part of you. We are all part of this state together. Have a good week. Rest up over this lovely weather weekend we're going to have, and prepare for it to be cold again on Tuesday. Have a good week.